Welcome back to Previously on Pod, where we talk about all things nostalgia TV. And today, this has been a long awaited one for me, we are going to talk about Aang from Avatar The Last Airbender. So, this show is one of my favorites, as I famously don't really like animation that much, which I know is kind of like a cardinal sin, especially in the world of nostalgia TV. But there are several exceptions, and one of them is Avatar The Last Airbender. If it's done super well, I'm hooked. And this was one of those shows, primarily because of the main character, Aang. The reason I wanted to make this video is because I feel like Zuko gets a lot of love, rightfully so, and maybe some other characters like Uncle Iroh. But Aang really, to me, is my favorite character in the show, the one I'm most interested in even. And I think he is the ultimate hero. I think he is the archetype for hero. And I want to talk about why. So let's get started. Okay, so one of the things that I love about Aang is that he is a sort of childlike wonder about him, sort of an unabashedly extroverted character, very curious about people and the world. I like that he causes a lot of his own problems. We'll talk about why. I think that there's a uniqueness to his character because not only is he more powerful than the other characters, which is a defining feature of a hero, right? A sort of special gifting or talent, but also just the way the show is set up, even by name, he is the last airbender. There's nobody else who does anything close to what he does. And throughout this video, I'm going to compare Aang a few different times to characters like Percy Jackson or Harry Potter. Now, I don't know, maybe there are better comparisons, but these are the ones that I grew up with and loved. And I think Aang is pretty distinctly different from both of those guys. And one of those reasons would be that Aang and his airbending and his childhood life as a monk, and even growing up 100 years before all of the other characters, sets him apart automatically. It automatically, to me, makes him interesting. So when you throw him into a scene, it's going to bring something that none of the other characters could have brought. There are some elements of this with Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, or really any hero story. The hero tends to be the new character. It's a really great way to get to do exposition because you're bringing in somebody new and having to explain the whole world to them, just like you do for the reader. Avatar The Last Airbender does this even with their title, right? Or I guess their title sequence is what I'm saying. They've got that really awesome everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. I think it was super well done. Bit of exposition. Another huge thing that I love about the show that will tie in to why I think Aang is such a great hero is honestly the atmosphere of the show. It is stunning. I want to I'm curious, I guess, about a lot of the decisions that were made in the show because I know it borrows so much from Eastern culture and yet is made by Western creators. So there's still quite a bit of Western in there as well. Whatever it is, I think it's beautiful. I think they use ancient storytelling as a structure for the story. So because it's written out in books and it's like unveils like a scroll each episode, that it makes the sort of oral retelling of the history every episode feel purposeful and part of the tone instead of just, again, forced exposition. So little details like that really aren't that little. I love the feel of the show, and that's just a huge part of why I wanted to make a video. But let's talk a little bit more about Aang. So here is my gripe with a lot of main characters. I talked about this a little bit with my Rory Gilmore video, but I think main characters can fall into the trap of feeling bland and like the story and the plotline happens to them, and that it really could have been anybody. The hero could have been anyone, and it just so happens to be this one person. I think that's one of the weaker ways to write a hero. I think Harry Potter falls into this, unfortunately. I haven't read the books in a while, but there are a few moments in those books where Harry feels so different and distinct from everybody else that adding him into a scene made it drastically different. I mean, I just don't feel that way very much. And so I think part of what that stems from is that Harry's biggest defining feature, personality quality, is how much he loves his friends. Now, of course, this is a classic hero quality. You've got to love your friends because that's what emboldens you to kind of be the leader, to be courageous, all of these kinds of things. it's not really escapable. And of course, I'm saying that like it's like a horrible quality you'd want to escape. I just think it's like a little cliche, right? It's been done a lot. And they certainly do this with Aang, but I think in quite a different way. A little bit with Percy Jackson, there's a difference because Percy Jackson has quite a personality, right? He has distinct features about him that make him unique. You know, he's kind of sarcastic. He's dyslexic and ADHD, so he just has a different way of processing the world. He is, again, a little bit more unique in that he is the son of, you know, one of the top 3 gods. So there's a layer of kind of uncertainty and like almost, I don't say the word holiness, but something like that, that he is uncovering that's different from the other characters. A little bit different there, but I would still say Percy Jackson's main aim in every single book is like, I gotta defeat the bad guy to save my friends. And in both Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, they've got really strong supporting characters that are well worth saving, and we are with it. But here's my thing. Then always a part of the story is like, and we're saving the world. I don't feel like the world feels like a big part of the story, to be honest. I feel like Harry wants to save his friends, and I know a lot of the friends, but I don't really get a sense of like the whole world. Same with Percy Jackson. He's going to save his friends and all the other people, but there's just not that connection. There's not this higher stakes calling that tells me that they have some sort of passion for the larger world. They just have a passion for saving their friends, and, you know, they want to be nice and save everybody. Here's where Aang is different, okay? Aang wants to save the whole world. Part of this, I believe, is just the convention of the story and that it incorporates so many Eastern elements. One of those Eastern elements is a spiritual realm. I think this heightens the stakes of Aang's character so much, okay? They do a lot of subtle details to communicate even prior to some of the higher level, you know, we'll talk about the chakras in a minute because that's a favorite episode of mine, personally. Even before they get into the nitty-gritty of what type of spiritual realm this show is engaging with, we know that Aang loves animals, okay? He's got this deep connection with animals. And even looking back, that even reminds me of sort of a higher order calling, right? It's not just for the world and the people that are around him that's inspiring him, but he's almost inspired by things outside of himself, like an animal that, you know, you can't even directly communicate with. Although Aang, I think very purposefully can seem like at least he communicates with all of his pets that he loves dearly, but, you know, especially Momo and Appa. And once the spiritual realm is talked about in the story, it is pretty nature and animal centric. Again, I think this is pulling from the non-Western sides of the story in which, you know, the humans are not always the center of the world. And I think that's very compelling. It's just different from most of the Western stories I read, where it feels like, you know, winning a battle and, you know, a face-off of one person against the other person on even playing field is kind of the ultimate climax of the story. Avatar: The Last Airbender plays into that in many ways, but I think it like circumvents it in other ways. And I think Aang, another quality of him being, again, more otherworldly, even if it's not directly so, is I think him flying, him being up in the sky. Seriously, like he's higher in the sky than anybody else. He's got some connection to some outside world, something bigger than just the squabbles of the world. I find that really compelling. And just him being a monk, I think, is super cool because you imagine a monk to be a very solemn type of person. And that is not at all what we get in Aang, right? There's nothing really solemn about him at all. There's a responsibility in him, but that's actually one of his struggles, is kind of accepting those kind of serious burdens and responsibilities. And so we get to see a character who is spiritual in their own right, but it doesn't look as simple or as kind of in a box as we might expect. I think he does a lot of different things as a character. He's funny and curious and just really cares about the other characters, and so you just get a really strong voice with him because of some of these spiritual elements of the story, and just frankly just good writing for each episode, different, you know, plot points that happen. It feels like Aang is constantly being carried through a character arc where he's going to have to face up to not only our villain, like Fire Lord Ozai, but at the end of the day, is it ever really about Aang's strength up against Ozai's? I was looking at some stuff on Reddit just because I wanted to prep for this video and see how people talked about Aang He's well loved, of course. But I think it's interesting because there were several people that thought in hindsight, wait, Aang kind of took out the Fire Lord Ozai pretty quickly. Yes, there's this big barrier to him not being able to get into the Avatar state, which we'll talk about the whole chakras locking. And yes, he tried to fight earlier and, Azula pulled a fast one on him. But when it comes down to that end fight, spoiler alert, I guess, it feels like Aang takes him out pretty easily. And I think that's important. Maybe the whole story really wasn't built around the pinnacle of that last battle, but really it was something about Aang that he had to learn within himself in order to be able to be the leader that people needed him to be. I find that so much more compelling than just the fact that a battle is happening and that it's happening to that character and he's the only one that could do it. It feels very much like not only is he the only one that could do it, but that he needs to find a way within himself for him to do it. Of course, we get some of these elements, I think, in those other stories. Like, I'm thinking about, it's been so long since I read Harry Potter, but I know that there is a certain, like, part where there's, like, a real tension between him being connected to Voldemort, and I think that's, like, one of the more nuanced parts of the story, is that he almost has to put that to death, right? Harry has to die and use the stone to come back to life, because otherwise there was going to be a part of him that was conflicting with his outward mission. Something like that I think is really compelling, and I think Avatar does this without even needing the kind of crazy plot device of, the character having like a connection to the villain, right? It doesn't even have that plot element, and yet I still feel like Aang is being conflicted by the role that he's having to take on. So I think that is super interesting and unique to me and makes him a more compelling hero. Now let's talk about chakras. So I'm not very well versed, but I do know that one thing I appreciated about this episode is that it calls up that same idea of a hero wanting to save his friends. So much so that Aang cannot go through with the giving up of the worldly cares in order to reach that higher spiritual realm. He says, I can't do it. And it becomes a big roadblock for him. And when he's finally able to overcome it is when we kind of see that character arc come to fruition. And a lot of that has to do with Katara. Aang's always loved Katara, and it started off in a very sort of childish love of kind of almost maternal love of just wanting support and look at me and give me praise. And then over time, it developed into just such a deep devotion and dedication to her. And I think, again, she kind of stands in place for lots of different people that he wants to protect and cares about. And being able to give her up is actually sort of a maturing point in their relationship, because all throughout the series, again, you get kind of him doting on her like a little puppy dog. And she's older and more mature and unsure of how to navigate a relationship with such a close friend, but again, almost him distancing himself in some metaphorical way, not actually, but like the distancing of him saying, I'm not going to want this more than anything because I have a mission that's more important than just how I feel and how someone else makes me feel good. But setting that aside is actually what brings them together in the end, which I think is really lovely and potentially, intentional on the behalf of the writers. So along with some of these Eastern elements like unlocking the chakras, I think of Uncle Iroh, a beloved character. Again, I think because he stands out. He's so different. He's so disciplined. He reminds me of a monk in some ways. Like, I'm thinking of the part when he's in prison and he all of a sudden is like becoming ripped and just doing all these pull-ups and everything, and just really devoted to his purpose in life, whether he's in prison or not. I mean, that is a very like fanatically religious idea, and I think it's packaged in such a way that is like really attractive to people. I think especially Western viewers, because of kind of the humor, and we're not as used to older characters being forefront in a story, so it does kind of feel silly. But I think that Aang in a lot of ways is similar to Uncle Iroh, and that he cares about higher order things. He has wisdom. And I love that about Aang. He is a young hero who has wisdom, and yet he's constantly messing up. So that's kind of one of the last points that I wanted to make, was that, again, when I'm thinking about Harry Potter, I don't really feel like Harry is messing up all the time. I feel like things happen to him, like bad things happen to him, and so there constantly have to be other people kind of trying to get in his way. But those seem to be more of the dilemmas that he's in. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know that it's probably been a while, and I do love Harry Potter, so I'm not trying to rip on it. I just feel like the strengths of Harry Potter are maybe not in always the characters or even the main character, but there's just so much other good stuff. I think a lot of ways it is really, relying on some of these archetypal characters to represent something else. There's so much like Latin, and it feels like there's such an appreciation by J.K. Rowling of kind of a medieval retelling of sorts that I feel like I'm not downplaying it that the characters might seem more formulaic, because that's how a lot of those writings were, and yet she's doing something really creative and just incredible with the plot and the atmosphere. Whereas when I think about Avatar: The Last Airbender, I think of really awesome plot and atmosphere and really awesome characters. And so that's just something I wanted to highlight specifically with Aang, because, it's one thing to create really compelling side characters, again, like Uncle Iroh, who are funny and quotable, but to be able to do something similar with your main character, I think is rare. I haven't seen that a whole lot. Aang, on the other hand, yes, people are coming after him, and there's constantly this back and forth. I still don't feel like he always makes the right decision, right? I think there are times where he's selfish and childish, and times where he's just silly and he makes a wrong move and he's too trusting, and kind of these small little, like, I don't want to say flaws, but kind of missteps, small little missteps, I think, that make him interesting. You never know what he's going to do. He's not always just going to do the thing that has to move the plot along. Sometimes he's going to, be a little street performer for an episode or something like that. And I think the lightness that they're able to maintain with such a kind of larger than life character who has highest stakes. Even when I think about Greek stories, because I was kind of saying, the Western story is why we get this kind of lower stakes, physical altercation battle. But even when I'm thinking about ancient Greek stories, there's always muses, right? And gods and interventions from above that make it feel like a higher ordered story. And I think we very much get this with Avatar: The Last Airbender. Aang is a sort of demigod. He's connected to the ancestors who have this kind of spiritual oversight. But again, it's not the exact kind of setup as a Western, god, demigod type of thing. So it's still a little bit different from what I would have expected from just growing up reading a lot of Western texts. So I think that's very cool. But yeah, it doesn't ever feel like things are just happening to Aang. It feels like he's also doing things back to the plot, which I love. One thing that I was thinking about the trio, the friend group, because I love this trio. I love watching them. Again, kind of a staple, kind of a trope of a lot of these stories. There's three friends. And this is curious to me because I'm thinking about Harry Potter in particular. We get kind of Hermione as the type A, and Ron and Harry are both a lot more type B. I think this makes Hermione stand out a lot, and it almost amplifies her differences from the guy characters. And Ron is a little bit more of a comic relief. There are a few moments where Harry is funny. There are just a few, and I love them, but they're few and far between. And Hermione as well, she's funny in that we kind of can laugh at her neuroses, but she's not necessarily a funny character in and of herself. And so in some ways it could be easy to reduce Ron to the comic relief and Hermione to the uptight one, and you just can't do that with Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I think it's awesome. So with Aang is pretty type B. He's kind of a type B hero, which again is not uncommon. I think Harry Potter kind of fits into that. I think Percy Jackson definitely does. And Percy Jackson probably falls a little bit of a more similar setup, because Annabeth would be very, type A comparatively, and so is Katara. So they've kind of got that balance. Grover, I think, ends up being a little bit less of a strong character just because he's not around as much throughout all of the books. And his, I guess you could probably go either way, but I would probably say more of a type A character. And that's actually what I would say for Sokka and Katara as well. They are, I think, both type A. But here's kind of the catch, is that Sokka is still sort of the comic relief. He's the funny guy, but he's also kind of type A. And I think that's curious because most of the time they would have the funny guy be the really easygoing one, and that would be offset by making your other two characters, more buttoned up. But that's not what they do. In fact, I think Sokka gets put into less a box of funny guy because Aang is also the funny guy, right? He's also making jokes. So Aang kind of gets to play both angles. He's both funny guy, but also, our hero. And so he's kind of like, and he's kind of less organized and younger. So Sokka kind of gets to be a little bit of an authority at times for Aang, also gets to be a little buddy. Also, Katara, I think, is less ostracized than maybe some other female characters in these kinds of setups. Now, I feel like her character, I would assume, gets a lot of pushback. Like, watching it back, it feels a little bit like she's made out to be a pretty uptight young woman, when in fact, I don't actually fully see it that way. I think it could be easy to see it like that because of the time period. There are a lot of bickering that happens between Sokka and Katara, kind of borderline, misogynistic stuff about girls versus guys and what they can do and what they should do and how they should act. You get a little bit of that Wendy Peter situation between Aang and Katara, and I think it definitely starts off that way, where she's the more mature one, being a mother to keep him in line. But I think it evolves past that, and I think the fact that Sokka and Katara are siblings is what makes this one the most different, right? They have a connection all their own that's separate from Aang, and so it kind of feels like two separate important connections coming together, the Avatar and then this kind of family that he doesn't have, and you put them both together and you've got something great. Whereas most of the time, the three characters are bonded centrally by the main character, not something outside of that. So I think that's unique, and I actually think it works pretty well for our story because it makes them feel more important just because they've got further connections that are just than those just connected to the main character. They could exist on their own, and in fact there are a few more experimental episodes in form where Aang's not the central figure, right? They'll go around and tell a lot of people's different stories. That's another favorite episode, right? Is it the Appa's Lost Days, where they go around and kind of tell each person's story? And I think it's also why Avatar: The Last Airbender saw such success with many different characters. You bring in Toph, and it's a perfect fit. And I think that's because the dynamic of the main characters wasn't resting solely on Aang, but they all brought something different to the table and had their own storylines going, so that Toph could just kind of, I think she actually came in and was able to be a little bit more of a foil, because she's kind of the type B girl. So now there's kind of the two type Bs and the two type As. And again, forgive me if I'm making it too simple, type A and type B, just for the sake of the archetype conventions. It just seems like a good way to think about it. But yeah, and as well as Zuko, right? Zuko is such an important character, and he ends up developing bonds with Katara and with Aang that I think viewers really latched onto. And it's actually kind of interesting and surprising and unexpected when you think about it, because he does not spend a ton of time in conversation with any of these characters, even at the end. And yet those bonds, I think, were there because he had such a strong story arc on his own that the second you bring him in with this new group of people, you kind of already know where he fits. Another one of my favorite episodes, actually, is the one where the beach episode, right? The one where all of the Fire Nation kids are hanging out at the beach, and you get Azula and, Mai and Zuko and Ty Lee, all those characters come together. And again, it feels natural. It feels like kind of where they all fit in the friend group. And I guess that's just good writing, of just being super clear and intentional from the get-go, that it's, again, not just the plot happening to a bunch of people who happen to have powers or something, but rather the story is written around them, right? Zuko is integrally tied to the Fire Nations attacking, and Aang is integrally tied to the resistance and the people who are fighting back against that. And so I just think it works very well, and it makes the story feel balanced and natural, which is, I think those are awesome words to use because of those Eastern influences, where it's kind of about finding an equilibrium, and it's not as much good guy versus bad guy, but at the end of the day, you know, you kind of see that reconciling moment with Zuko and Aang coming together, and you're like, well, they're just two sides of the same coin. They're so similar. And I love that. Again, not trying to talk on Harry Potter. I feel bad. I love, you know, Harry and Draco and that whole dynamic. But I think there's a reason why there's so much like fan fiction written about Draco, is because I think he's a little underutilized as a character. He like becomes a good guy at the end when they flash forward and he's sending his kids to Hogwarts or something. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, we didn't really get to see fully all of that. And we do a little bit, right? And the fact that he doesn't step up to kill Dumbledore, you know, you kind of see him crumbling in on himself. But I don't think you see fully him mirrored back to Harry and how they were in some ways being kind of brought up in a similar way, like set up to act a certain way and to serve a certain role. And I think it would have been really cool to kind of see that coming back together. Whereas in a story like Avatar The Last Airbender, because the stakes are so high, because the world, spiritual and otherwise, is depending on, you know, balance and order being restored. And that's even the language that they use, right? Restoring order. Because of that, it's only natural, you know, it necessitates that everybody kind of comes back together into one state instead of, you know, good guys slicing over bad guys, which feels way more Western and maybe in some ways more simplistic. Again, I'm open to hearing other opinions on that, but my whole impetus for making this video was just thinking that the kind of Eastern elements that are brought into this story is what makes it so different from most hero stories. And what makes Aang the ultimate hero is the fact that he is connected to something higher than just the plot of the story, but his very character is about bringing the world together, just on his own, right? Being the Avatar, that is like, he is this restorer of all things and kind of the one who can connect all the elements together. I think it's just well written and it's beautiful to see it all unfold. And there are many different characters. You get to see the many different facets of kind of the natural order of the world all come back together and be together at the end. I just think it's super well done. I love so many elements about it. But of course, I think the writing does stand out for me, just as someone who loves writing. That's always going to be like the dialogue and the quotes that I continue to come back to with that show, or what make it so nostalgic for me. It does make me feel like a kid again. And just getting to watch the beautiful art and everything come together. It's just a well-painted story. And I think Aang is kind of the pinnacle of that story, which I think is a bit of a unique take. Even though everyone loves him, I think maybe not that many people would recognize of just how unique of a hero he really is. And I would love to see more heroes like Aang on the screen. And so, yeah, I hope you like this video, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you also kind of see Aang as different from some of these other archetypal heroes that we've seen. Thanks for your time. Bye.